In today's video, I want to discuss the topic of whether expensive tools matter. Should you either be spending more upfront on a certain type of tool or spending more to upgrade a certain tool you already have? If you're looking for a super short answer to this, it's a little tough, but I'm going to just say yes, but in two different ways. So yes, but there's more nuance to it. To approach this, we have to split two different things here that matter to us. The outcome of our woodworking, the final project, product, whatever it is, and the experience of our woodworking. What is it like to use the tool? These are two different things, and two things that people may care both about or care only about one. And the difference in how spending money impacts each of them is different, a lot different in my opinion. Now let's get this out of the way quick. Time and experience will improve your woodworking more than any tool expensive upgraded version will. It's as simple as that. You will become better and your outcomes will be better if you spend more time doing it, practicing it, perfecting it. But better tools can help you achieve that better result, often in marginal ways. But the tool itself, being a more expensive tool, can do that in some cases. However, that graph, were we to plot it, would look like this. Okay, so that would mean we've got a bottom level tool right here, mid-level tool right here, expensive, super expensive. We're going to get a pretty big boost going from bottom tier to that kind of mid tier. We're going to get a little bit more boost going mid to kind of high, low, high. And then we're going to get just a little bit before we plateau going to super expensive in terms of the actual outcomes. That doesn't mean necessarily the capabilities. For example, the really expensive giant planer will allow you to plane a wider board, but it's not going to make your board more parallel, for instance. On the other side of the equation, though, we have the experience, the thing that a lot of us who aren't doing this for a living care a lot about. Some people, I'm sure, they're doing it to survive. It's their living. They come in the shop, they make the product. All they care about is the return on the product, and that's fine. But I imagine for most people watching this, the experience of woodworking matters sometimes even more than the actual final product or project. This graph looks a lot different, in my opinion, in my experience. If we start out kind of, we got low cost tools down here, mid cost, high, super high. This graph goes a lot more like this, but it also eventually plateaus. We can't spend an infinite amount to get infinitely perfect stuff. But the jump between levels is much steeper in my opinion. Now, it's steepest, I believe, between the bottom level and the mid level. I think the jump there is often dramatic. Let's say between just from my experience, a Ryobi table saw to the job site DeWalt 7491. For me, that was a dramatically improved experience. So we've got this pretty big upward step. Now, obviously I eventually got a cabinet saw, the 1.75 saw stop. So on the lower end, I guess I'll call it, of how much you could pay for a really nice cabinet saw. Still hurts the wallet to this day, but I still have the DeWalt, right? So it's not like that DeWalt was so bad I got rid of it. I still absolutely have it. So we're here at the mid tier. We've made this pretty sharp jump up in experience. We've got, we'll call it the high end, but not the super high end. That jump is still going to be up pretty fast, but it's nowhere near as steep in my opinion, but it's steep enough that it matters. And then we've got the high end and the super high end. And this one's going to be kind of less gradual, or more gradual, excuse me, less steep. And then it's going to plateau, right? Like going from like the actual user experience of the 1.75 saw stop to, let's say, the 5 horsepower is just going to be about motor size. Other than that, as far as I know, with the PCSs, everything else is the same. It's just a bigger motor. Or maybe that's the 3 horsepower. I forget what the biggest PCS is. But other than the motor size, the experience overall is the same. So we've got only one differentiating factor, which is why we're still going up, but we're not going up as steep. So we've got these two different levels, right? Our outcomes will certainly improve some. Our experience will improve a lot in my experience. That doesn't mean we have to buy the most expensive version of every tool, and we'll talk later about where we should spend our money, but this is just about, yes, money can and will improve things in woodworking. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, a lot of people don't want to admit it, but that is my experience and I will stand by that. So in what ways are we getting improved outcomes? What is it that we're paying more money for that improves our outcome? And then we'll touch on experience. Well, the biggest ones in my opinion are accuracy, repeatability, and then oftentimes just features. When you go up a level in cost, and we'll call it better tool version of the same tool. They're often more accurate. They often stay accurate longer. They have more adjustability to make them more accurate. There's often a reliability in them staying accurate, that kind of thing, and it makes a difference. This table saw, I consistently can have it stay and know it's at 90 and not have to worry about it. I just do a check once a year just for routine maintenance. On my Ryobi, every time I used the saw, I had to check it. It was almost never still square. And it was a nightmare, but I used it for 2 years. On the DeWalt, it felt like every month I needed to check it. I still don't know how it would get out of square sometimes. It's got that rack and pinion, but there would be enough times where I'd make a cut and I'd notice the thing had a slight taper to it and I'd have to go back and correct it. That's okay, that's fine. It wasn't, it's $500, at least that's what I paid at the time. So I accepted that, but still annoying. If you make that cut and you didn't check it ahead of time, that piece could be ruined. With this guy, I just don't even think about it anymore. It's always there. I check it once a year and it's usually still there. If I were to clang into it, of course, I would need to check it. But so accuracy, that's going to get us big outcomes. Accuracy in other ways. The miter slots in this saw stop, for instance, are much more consistent throughout the length of the miter slot. If I were to get the calipers out and compare that to the DeWalt, to the Ryobi, which has its own little proprietary thing, you would notice a more consistent width along there, which means miter gauges and miter bars that we make out of wood, whatever, will slide through it better. We don't get as many of those sticking points, which can be really annoying if you're using solid wood, some kind of hardwood for your miter sled, and it just kind of jerks along because there's got some narrower parts. And then so you have to kind of make it a little narrower, but then it's a little loose in the wider parts. So the ability for the manufacturing at a much more expensive price to be consistent in the accuracy of the miter slot is a perfect example, and I think it leads to better cuts. But they're only marginally better. This is why we are kind of working on the margins when we're spending money. And we could spend a lot of money compared to the mid-tier, but our increase in result is not equal to that giant jump, but it is an increase. Now, in terms of outcome to experience, there are a couple things that kind of mesh here and then just some experience on their own. So let's talk about the meshing of the middle here. Another good example from the table saw, Ryobi, very small, very lightweight. DeWalt, smallish, medium size, got more weight to it. Saw stop, cabinet saw, gigantic, super heavy, huge. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, the tabletop is a reference surface and the fence is a reference surface. So the bigger and the longer they are, and assuming the quality is increasing with each of them, we have more reference surface to work off of, which is very important in woodworking. Every cut is referenced off of both the table and most referenced off the fence, not all of them though, but those are two very important things that we have more room to work with, making it kind of heavier, which leads to less vibration. So our cuts are a little cleaner, things like that. On the Ryobi, I didn't have a bench at the time. I didn't have anything at the time. And I used to have to put dumbbells behind it because when I'd be cutting some kind of wet pressure treated lumber, the saw had such a tiny motor and weighed so little that it would almost push the saw back if I didn't add weight to it. And it wasn't it couldn't do the cut, it just, the thing didn't weigh enough to stop that. And then I get the DeWalt job site. It's got nice rubber feet. It weighs, 100 some pounds, probably no biggie there. And then of course you get this gigantic behemoth thing. This obviously isn't going anywhere. So that's a simple example of both the experience, but then also the quality of the cut is going to change based upon whether your table saw is doing one of these on the way through the cut. So what about just pure experience? Well, there's a great one that I think about quite a bit when I use the saw stop. I assume it's similar for other cabinet saw brands, but it involves the raising and lowering an angle tilt method for the blade. Again, all of these three saws at different price levels, they can all raise and lower the blade and they can all tilt the blade, but the experience of doing it is significantly different. On that little Ryobi, that thing is so tiny, you're kind of you're doing one of these little things. It's unbelievably annoying. The DeWalt, little better. It's got a little more size to it. I was just using it the other day to cut some pressure treated lumber outside, and I needed to raise the blade quite high to do a miter. It felt like I sat there for 5 minutes twisting that little thing. And of course it eventually gets up there, but it's just not a good experience. Step over to the saw stop. It's this giant wheel. The thing feels like it's raising and lowering itself. You could just kind of half-handed almost, and it'll be up in 2 or 3 turns. Not at all relevant to the actual ability to raise and lower the blade or have an angle to cut something, but the experience is significantly different between those 3 levels. Now, another example of something blending in the middle, and this is one that I haven't had experience with the higher end yet, but the bandsaw. Every bandsaw has to have the blade tracked and aligned properly, or else it won't work that well. You get fluttering, your cuts won't be as straight, etc., etc. If you have a bandsaw, you'll know how important that is. I started out with the little Ryobi bandsaw. I've got the Rikon benchtop now. I've never used a floor standing expensive one, but the Rikon is kind of as close as you're going to get to that in terms of quality, but in a smaller package, so I think it's close enough. The mechanism and experience for tracking and tensioning the blade on the Ryobi was an absolute nightmare. I hated changing the blade because it would take me 10-15 minutes. It didn't seem like it wanted to stay correctly. My cuts, I had fluttering blades, so it was bad outcome or not as good outcome, not as good experience. I get to the Rikon, which has a very kind of professionally done mechanism. It takes me a minute. I'll change the blade, no problem now. It's very easy to track and tension. Sure, there's a bit of a learning curve, but it holds that. Everything is just so much smoother in the experience, but that impacts the performance too. If you're on the Ryobi and it flutters in the middle of a cut, you're going to end up going deeper into your piece than you want to. And I'm just going to assume on expensive saws that they are at least as good as the Rikon, in which case they are much better in experience than the Ryobi. What's another good example here? Well, dust collection. I've got a wall-mounted Grizzly something or other on the wall. I'll call it the mid-tier, right? I started with a rigid shop vac. Then I got this thing, the rigid shop vac can't handle that. So I didn't want to spend a ton of money. I didn't want to go high end, but I needed something that could move enough volume. I also didn't want to spend, like $1,000. Something like $500 to $700 was all I was willing to accept. So I made a trade-off. I got the motor size, but I got a filter that isn't the best filter in the world. Those were the 2 options on something kind of that size. You could spend multiple hundreds, I think, extra and get a better filter. And because of that, there is still a very fine layer of dust that sits around this entire room. It does a very good job at the tool, but it cannot capture that extremely fine dust, which is the most dangerous dust. So experience and outcome both impacted there. I don't notice in my shop time having problems with dust collection, and it clears the tools of dust as good as I need it. So the outcome of the actual tool on the woodworking, those chips are getting out of there. On the planer, they're not getting pressed back in. Experience-wise though, I'll call it cut some corners, save some money. And I've got this fine layer of floating dust around here. So if I had spent more money and got the HEPA filter, I would not have as much of that dust floating around here. What do we do with this information now that I believe I've established that spending more money on tools can both increase the outcome some and the experience a lot? What do we do with that? We don't have infinite money. There's no code to type in here to cheat and get infinite money glitch. What we have to do is we have to focus in on what are we using every day, what do we need to be the most comfortable to use and have the best outcomes. For me, someone who does fine woodworking, but mainly just small kind of delicate projects, the table saw is the heart of my shop. I'm not doing decking. If you're doing decking, perhaps the circ saw is going to be the heart of your day, cutting those boards to lengths, or the chop saw, something like that. And the accuracy and experience there is going to matter more. So the thing you have to do at first is understand that you've got a limited budget, even if it's over the years. Identify what is the most important thing to the shop in terms of how often you use it, therefore the experience, and what the outcomes need to be the best at. Once we've identified that, with whatever version we currently have, we then ask ourselves, is the experience with this good enough? And is the outcome good enough? If both of those are a yes, then you don't say need, but you don't need to spend the money on upgrading that tool yet. You can move on to the second tier tool. What do you use the second most? What is the experience? What is the outcome? However, if we're at that first tier of tool, we use it all the time, and there's just something you hate about it, and you've got the money, that's a tool we can spend more money upgrading. Maybe ideally we can even sell the previous one, recoup some of that money, something like that. Great. Okay, we've figured out what we want to spend money on in terms of the big boys, the big tools, the things we use every day. What about the accessories and secondary things? Because for me, this is one that I don't want to say skimp on, but I definitely aim for mid-tier or lower tier with a lot of accessories. A couple examples, chisels. I went with the Narex, $60 for the set. I don't know what you could do to a chisel to make it worth $200 for a set, but those are great. I love them. Totally fine spending the mid-tier money there. Never going to spend a high amount of money on chisels. Now, for me personally, measuring tools are very important, but there's also kind of a marginal gain there too. There's only so accurate that you can get while spending infinitely more money. We're woodworkers, we're not machinists, so we don't need that kind of extreme high-end accuracy from our squares, our compasses, our gauges, whatever, but we need it to be pretty good. But me personally, I have a couple different squares. I've got this Grows Machinist square, I've got this Woodpecker square, and I've got this PEC square. I did not buy this, this was given to me. I bought these two, and they were both a step up from this guy and then this other little Milwaukee. I think most of us have used a carpenter square at some point or another. A lot of times they're not particularly accurate, but we don't really know how accurate we need them to be when we get them. We just assume we're buying a square, therefore it's square, right? Well, oftentimes, if you can upgrade on this, even to the middle tier, I highly suggest doing it. And that's what I did. I didn't want to spend a ton of money, but I wanted to hit a middle ground. I bought a machinist square because they are not as functional in terms of actual measuring, but for the good kind of mid-tier price, you can get something that is actually known 90 degrees. Tool setup was what I bought this for. So I can set up all my tools to a base level of 90. I think it was only $18 or $20, perfect. But I needed something else to actually use as a combination square. I looked at woodpeckers and I laughed at how comically expensive they were. That didn't mean I didn't want it, but like that was out of the question for me. And somebody on a forum somewhere mentioned PEC and PEC blemished. I got lucky when I happened to be shopping. They had some blemished ones in. These are not always in. They're hard to come by. You got to check back regularly, but I think this is a perfect middle ground. I think I paid $35 for this and then maybe $10 for a 6-inch ruler that goes in here. So I got kind of the functionality of both. So let's say between these two, what is that? $65, $70. Awesome. This single thing right here is, I don't know, $120. And yes, it is 90 degrees. I've checked these against each other. They're all 90 degrees. And it's really nice to use. The knurling feels good. It's whatever. This is not worth that infinite amount more. I'll call it infinite, but that extreme amount more than these two. These two do the job really well, and they're pretty darn good at it, but they sit in that mid-tier price. So for me, this is an area where if you're doing any kind of fine woodworking, you should be considering spending more here, but you don't need to spend the most unless you just have money to roll around it. I also should mention that if you're looking at these indexables, I have a review, and the one thing you should know more than anything is they are gigantic. So if you don't want a gigantic square, it's not going to be for you. Another example of when it comes to accessories that I personally ran into was drill bits, brad point bits specifically. I'm going to do another video sometime on these fish brad point bits, but I got into the idea of having brad point bits. I think a lot of woodworkers discover them at some point, and I didn't want to spend a lot of money because I normally go for the cheaper mid option first. So I get this DeWalt kit for, I don't know, 15 bucks, something like that. Everything seems fine. It's drilling holes. They're clean enough until I got a plug cutter. And I needed a 1/4 inch hole. I needed to put something in there and I needed to plug it up. I got a nice American-made plug cutter that was a 1/4 inch. I trusted it. I spent a little more than normal because I, assuming these were a 1/4 inch, knew I needed that to definitely be a 1/4 inch. Well, little did I know, I cut my plug after drilling these holes, and what do you know? This isn't exactly a 1/4 inch. It's bigger. Okay, fine. I'm in big trouble there. I make the plugs different. I make them another way and plug it up. Well, okay, that's not good enough then if I need to plug the hole. So I start shopping around and I find fish, and then to my absolute love, I find that fish sells individual drill bits. So I didn't have to put a ton of money up front. I was able to buy individuals. I've got more of them over the time, but I bought this, I did a test, and that plug fit perfectly. I would never have known had I not done that plug hole filling, but the minute I needed it to be that accurate, to be more precise, reliable, suddenly I knew I had to spend a little bit more money. Now, for a lot of people, that's not something they're going to care about. They don't need super precise drilled holes, drill bit wise. Fine. You don't need to spend the money there. Other people are going to need to spend even more than this to get even more accuracy. There's a reason plug cutters are slightly tapered, not only to help you get in the hole, but to help deal with slightly oversized holes as well. So what's one last area where we can kind of possibly make a compromise? Well, I think that's with benchtop tools. We can still spend quite a good amount of money on benchtop tools. Within any benchtop tool, there are ranges of prices, but they are significantly less than the floor standing version. Now, for me, a lot of that is space related, but if I really wanted to, I could somehow try to cram at least a couple more full-size tools in here. I'd have to give some stuff up, but it physically probably could be done. I may have to build an add-on shed for everything else, but I go benchtop for most things. Okay, fine, fair enough. So you may be asking yourself, well, if I have benchtop tools, I can afford more things, but what am I perhaps giving up? I went through this question at one point because I wanted to spend some money and get some things that were, I'll call it buy once, cry once, but buy once, cry once within my actual budget. I don't, I'm not super wealthy. I can't buy a $40,000 planer, so that's just not even an option. But I'm looking at the planer. And I'm seeing these floor standing models. At that time, I didn't have some of these, so I still had some room in here. And we were talking like $2,000 for a 15-inch helical, whatever, but like kind of the base end of the nice floor standing models. That's a lot of money. It probably with freight and taxes would have been probably closer to $2,400. And I said to myself, Miles, what are you thinking? You don't need this thing, right? What can you get instead? And obviously, you'll know there's no standing planer in here. I went with the instead option. So what did I get? Well, I got a bunch of tools that were either on the low end or in the mid end. For that $2,400, instead, I got the DeWalt 735, at the time $500. I got that dust collector, $700-ish all in. So we're up to $1,200. Rycom bandsaw, $500, so that's $1,700. Let's add in the Wen drill press, that's $1,900, it was about $200, and then the Wen benchtop belt and disc sander, $2,000, same price. I can still plane wood, and I've got all these other tools. So for me, I didn't need to spend the max on that. I decided to go the route of get a bunch of lower end, mid end kind of tools. However, these tools also are compromises, but they are compromises on things that I don't notice. The run out on the Wen is perfectly fine for me. I'm never going to notice if it's not quite as precise as a $1,000 Powermatic. Totally fine for me. If you are a machinist drilling very specific holes, that's probably a no-brainer. For you, that is your floor standing planer. That is something you are probably going to want to spend the money on, and the other tools are not going to be needed in the same sense as having that perfectly accurate hole is. So it's not a question anymore. You can put those off because you need that drill press, and spending more money on that drill press is going to get you to that perfectly accurate hole. The point in this video was not to talk about how much money I've spent on tools. It was to cover the experience I've had stepping up in cost of tools, especially within the same kind of categories, and to share the experience that yes, you do get a better result in terms of the outcome of your woodworking marginally by going up in price, but you get a big step up in experience. So the saw handle raising and lowering, the experience there, significantly better on the saw stop. Outcome wise, the diameter of two holes, pretty important and different, very different between the DeWalt and the Fish brad point. Those are perfect examples of outcomes versus experience. You have to decide which matters to you. Do they both matter to you? Which one matters more? And then you can start approaching the question of, should I be spending more money on a certain type of tool? I think there are many, many tools where you don't need to, but there are some of them where if you've set aside the budget, take that dive. It's going to absolutely be worth it, especially if you are somebody who's looking for a better experience. All right. Thanks for joining me today. Bye.